Can we really fight fate? Are we all destined for some preordained way of life we truly have no control over? This question is at the heart of Sleepless in Seattle, Nora Ephron's 1993 romantic comedy. A critical and commercial hit at the time of its release, Sleepless in Seattle in the present day feels a little, well, slept on. Now, look, I'm not going to sit here and say that this movie is underrated or incorrectly label it as a cult classic. What I will say is that I don't think it gets re examined as often as other classic rom coms of its era. Think Pretty Woman or When Harry Met Sally, the latter of which feels very much like a foundational text of the genre. And especially when placed alongside these two cultural behemoths, Sleepless in Seattle seems perfectly serviceable in comparison. On the surface, it reads like a pretty straightforward romantic comedy, following the tried and true tropes of the genre, with two stars at the absolute zenith of their powers, that's Meg Ryan and Tom Hanks, occupying the star roles. Even from our vantage point of the present, the concept of long distance relationships is omnipresent thanks to the internet. Sleepless in Seattle's conceit of having its romantic leads not formally meet until the end of the movie may not even seem that novel. But I can't help but feel, with every rewatch, that there's more to this movie than meets the eye. Something about it that, even 30 years after its release, and in the shadow of a rom com renaissance featuring fresh, long overdue takes on the genre from a variety of marginalized perspectives, speaks to our current moment in time. Hi, I'm Dustin, aka The Film Fanatic, and welcome back to my channel. Today's video is the first installment of my first series on this channel, 1993 to present. If you watched my intro video or followed me to this channel from the blog that I had last year, 1972 to present, the general conceit of this series will sound familiar. I've always had this love/obsession for remembering birthdays or celebrating milestone anniversaries, particularly with pop culture artifacts like movies. This series will be an extension of that passion, with each video taking a closer look at a film released in, you guessed it, 1993, examining it through today's cultural lens and seeing what, if anything, it brings to today's world. So I actually chose 1993 for this series in particular for several reasons. First, it was just an amazing year for film with several blockbuster releases as well as smaller projects that are definitely worth talking about. But also, I chose 1993 because it happens to be my birth year, which, if you're doing your math right, yes, this means that I will be turning 30 this year. Which honestly, I'm kind of feeling okay about right now. But my birthday's not until September, so check in with me around then. Maybe my feelings will have changed. Okay, that's enough of my own personal existential dread. Let's talk Sleepless in Seattle. Sleepless in Seattle begins with our romantic leads on two divergent life paths. Sam, played by Hanks, is an architect living in Chicago who has just lost his beloved wife and must now face the prospect of raising his young son, Jonah, on his own. Realizing pretty quickly that he needs yet another radical change in his life, Sam uproots himself and Jonah from Chicago in favor of a literal seaside bungalow in Seattle, because why not? Meanwhile, in Baltimore, Ryan's Annie is a journalist newly engaged to her long-term beau, Walter. Her family and friends appear to like him, and the two are perfectly in sync, quite literally. She knows when to pass him the jug of water for his humidifier at night, one of the many remedies in his laundry list of deathly allergies. She even knows when to pass him a tissue to wipe up the backsplash. In many ways, Annie's life is just beginning, and while a chapter in Sam's life has tragically ended, Seattle should serve as his own new beginning. At least, that's what Jonah has in mind when he calls a nationally syndicated radio show to find his dad a new wife. It's the same radio show that Annie just so happens to be listening to all the way in Baltimore, tearfully following along to Sam's every word as he laments his late wife and explains how he copes with her loss. "I'll get out of bed in the morning," he says. "Breathe in and out." And with one heartfelt monologue, Annie has fallen in love with the voice on the radio, Sleepless in Seattle, as the host calls him. One might assume what unfolds for the remainder of the movie's runtime. Annie initially fights her feelings, deeming them irrational. Sam blows off his son's admirable attempts to find him a new bride. But, because this is a romantic comedy after all, a cosmic set of circumstances must bring them together. There's a formula to follow, after all. Except Ephron, the director as well as co-writer, alongside Jeff Arch and David S. Ward, has no plans to follow the formula. This is where Sleepless in Seattle gets interesting and, in my mind at least, becomes the closest thing the 90s had to a mainstream, queer romantic comedy. Big claim, I know, but let me explain first how I'm using the term queer in this instance. Because despite the presence of queer actors like Rosie O'Donnell, Victor Garber, and David Hyde Pierce in supporting roles, the movie doesn't have much of a sexuality to speak of. It's the 90s, so we assume that all the characters are heterosexual, but apart from a few comments about getting laid, the movie itself is pretty sexless. Here, I'm using queer in a more academic sense, i.e., the ways in which to queer a space or institution is to destabilize the norms of those spaces and institutions. The institution in mind here? The romantic comedy itself. I'm assuming most, if not everyone watching this, has at least a working knowledge of romantic comedy conventions, so I won't get too exhaustive with the details here. But if we break the romantic comedy down into its simplest parts, we see that most follow a similar arc. We almost always start with the meet cute, where our love interests meet through sometimes fantastic but always charming circumstances. There's a period of interaction, maybe some spiky banter, a date or two, before we get to the disruption or deception, where a significant event occurs that results in a miscommunication between the love interests, or one of the love interests' deception is revealed. They separate, and we're left wondering, will it work out? The answer is usually yes, thanks to the grand gesture, which takes the form of an often dramatic act, one, or both, of the love interest participates in that proves their love is real. Happiness and order are restored, and we get our happily ever after. Sleepless in Seattle certainly ends with a grand gesture, with both our leads ending up at the top of the Empire State Building, a la An Affair to Remember. Only they get there by skipping the first two steps of the formula altogether. In all the ways that matter, this final scene in New York is Sam and Annie's meet cute. Technically, they do come face to face once before this, about halfway through the movie, when Annie makes an impulsive trip to Seattle to introduce herself to Sam. But even that doesn't materialize the way we'd expect. This encounter is a false introduction, merely a one-sided glance at the airport, a shared hello across a busy highway. Memorable, sure, but not the meet cute we've prepared for. And because Annie and Sam don't formally meet or interact until the very end of the movie, no disruption or deception has really occurred between them. If there's been any deception at all, it's been on the part of Jonah, who got his equally precocious friend to book him a flight to New York, knowing his dad would follow and thus meet Annie. The movie's general conceit was obviously a huge risk at the time it was made. In his book From Hollywood with Love, The Rise and Fall and Rise Again of the romantic comedy, Scott Meslow writes that for a genre that pretty much always lives or dies on the sparks between its two leading actors, the movie had to quote unquote get the tone just right to keep the audience invested. Luckily, with rom-com maestro Ephron in the directorial driver's seat and the undeniably perfect casting of Ryan and Hanks, who, again, were arguably two of the biggest stars in the world at the time, Sleepless in Seattle broke through all expectations by subverting what still remains an almost impenetrable formula. But even outside its obvious dismantling of genre tropes, the movie manages to also be subversive in other ways, ways that feel particularly prescient 30 years after its release. As of this recording in 2023, we're still living through a global pandemic that has undoubtedly altered the course of everyone's lives in ways big and small. The cracks in our own societal institutions that the pandemic has revealed have likely led many of us to question our own life paths and whether there's room for divergence from the direction we otherwise felt ourselves fated to take. We see Sam go through a similar existential crisis at the beginning of the movie. Again, the movie opens with his wife's death, the ultimate destabilizer. What Sam thought was his happily ever after has been upended. The solution for his grief at first is to deny it, to bury it in his work until he reaches a breaking point. Work hard, he says in justification of his actions. Work will save you. Work is the only thing that will see you through this. Until finally, what he realizes is that, quote, I think what I really need is a change. Though not dealing with a loss as monumental as Sam's, Annie is also in need of a change, even if she doesn't initially realize it. Despite her new engagement to Walter, she openly admits that she hasn't felt the quote-unquote magic of an all-encompassing romance in quite some time. Still, she insists that Walter is the man for her, even as she finds herself falling for Sleepless in Seattle over the radio waves. When radical change is offered as an alternative to a humdrum way of life, Annie sticks with what's comfortable, at least at first. When Sam and Annie do eventually meet and presumably get together, we're led to believe it's because they've finally given in to all the cosmic signs that proved, regardless of how wild the idea sounds, they were meant to be. I think it's a bit deeper than that. Instead of framing it as some preordained path doing all the work for them, I see their big meet cute as the culmination of a mutual rejection of their respective life norms. On their own, Annie and Sam realized that their lives as they weren't sustainable. They were in stasis, both in need of something unexpected to move their lives in a new, left of center direction. That's the part of the love story, as in the part of their love story where they're mostly apart, that rings the most true today. That moments of melancholy and seemingly unbreakable loneliness can cause us to upend what we thought was our destiny, to realize that we do have the power to change it into something beyond our wildest dreams. By her own admission, Nora Ephron wanted Sleepless in Seattle to be timeless. In an interview with the Baltimore Sun ahead of the movie's premiere, she said that, quote, we had to do a movie about love that I want people to watch for 20 years, and I don't want them to say, oh, that was made in 93. Well, here we are 30 years later, and at least from where I'm standing, I think she's succeeded, and not just for the obvious reasons. Sleepless in Seattle is a movie that checks off several of the traditional boxes to all but solidify its place in the pantheon of classic rom-coms, but its non-traditional structure and exploration of grief, loneliness, and feeling trapped within societal expectations have allowed it to live on well beyond Ephron's own modest estimation. Thank you all so much for tuning in to this video. This is actually my first capital V video on this channel. So if you stuck through until the end, I thank you so much. And while you're waiting for the next upload, let me know in the comments below what some of your favorite romantic comedies are. We are in the thick of rom-com season right now, and I definitely have my faves that I like to return to around this time of year, especially Sleepless in Seattle. Um, but let me know what some of your faves are. You can also follow me on my social medias, which you should see populate on the screen somewhere within the general vicinity of my face. I'd love to hear from you on there. Again, thank you so much. I'll see you the next time around.